The HFY Empire stretched across 12 star systems, and at its heart sat the most powerful ruler the galaxy had ever known, Emperor Vorathan IX, who commanded fleets that could burn worlds and armies that had never tasted defeat. Yet the true symbol of his power was not his crown or his weapons or his endless legions of soldiers, but rather a creature so terrifying that even the bravest warriors trembled at the mention of her name. Her name was Sereth, and she was a void lynx from the death world of Umbraxis Prime, a planet so dangerous that only 3 expeditions had ever returned from its surface, and those survivors had come back changed, haunted by what they had witnessed in the eternal darkness of that nightmare world. Void lynxes were not ordinary predators, for they possessed abilities that seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. And Sereth was the most magnificent and most deadly of them all, standing nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder, with fur as black as the space between stars. Fur that seemed to drink in light and give nothing back, and her 6 eyes glowed like molten silver, ancient and intelligent and filled with a fury that never seemed to fade. She could phase through solid matter as easily as a fish swims through water, passing through walls and armor and shields as if they did not exist. And her claws carried a neurotoxin so potent that a single scratch could paralyze a full-grown HFY warrior in seconds, leaving them conscious but helpless as she decided their fate. The HFY believed that void lynxes possessed something close to true sentience, an intelligence that rivaled many of the galaxy's speaking peoples, and they were sacred creatures in the Empire's ancient religion, symbols of shadow and death and the inevitable end that awaited all living things. But the most remarkable thing about void lynxes was their bonding, for each one would choose a single companion in their lifetime, forming a connection so deep that the two would become as one soul in 2 bodies, fighting together, living together, and eventually dying together. And a bonded void lynx would follow their chosen companion into any battle, any danger, any darkness without hesitation. Sereth had chosen no one. For 17 long cycles, she had lived in the Imperial Menagerie, the most prized and most feared creature in the Emperor's collection. And in all that time, she had rejected every single being who attempted to bond with her. And she had not merely rejected them, she had destroyed them. The Empire's finest beast tamers had tried, warriors who had bonded with creatures from 100 different worlds, masters of their craft who had never failed before. And Sereth had torn them apart without mercy, her silver eyes cold and empty as she ended their lives. Psychic bonding specialists had come from across the galaxy, beings who could touch minds and forge connections through pure mental power, and they had fared even worse. Fuzaroth's mind was a fortress of rage and grief that shattered anyone who tried to enter it, leaving 2 of them completely mad, trapped forever in whatever horrors they had witnessed inside her consciousness. Warrior priests had performed ancient rituals, speaking words of power that had bound beasts to masters for 10,000 years. And Sereth had listened to their chanting with what almost seemed like amusement before she killed them too. The count stood at 14 dead and 23 permanently maimed. Warriors and tamers and priests who would never walk again, never hold a weapon again, never live without pain again. All because they had dared to approach the Emperor's beast. Only Emperor Vorathan himself could stand in her presence without fear of death, for she tolerated him the way a great predator might tolerate a small creature that posed no threat and offered no interest, ignoring him completely most of the time, allowing him to pass through her domain without attack. But even he could not touch her, could not speak to her, could not reach whatever wounded heart beat within her shadow-wrapped chest. The galaxy whispered about Sereth, telling stories that grew more fantastic with each retelling. And the most common rumor was that she grieved something, that she had lost something so precious that her heart had turned to stone. and she would never accept another bond because no living being could replace what she had lost. But Emperor Vorathin was growing old, and his power depended partly on the symbol of the unconquered beast. And he knew that if he died without seeing Sereth bonded to a worthy successor, the political consequences could tear his empire apart. So he made a decision that would change everything. He announced a final summons, a challenge that went out to every species in the Galactic Concord, inviting their finest warriors and tamers and mystics to attempt what no one had achieved, promising unprecedented political favor and trade advantages to whatever species succeeded, and warning that the risk was almost certain death. Most species read the summons and politely declined, for they had heard the stories and seen the holographic recordings of previous attempts, and they had no desire to sacrifice their best people for such impossible odds. The Dravosi sent a champion, a 7-foot warrior named Korvax, who had killed a sandworm with his bare hands, and he lasted approximately 45 seconds before Sarah threw him through a reinforced window. The Velkathi sent a psychic master who had bonded with 17 different predator species, and she fled screaming after only 10 seconds of mental contact with Sarath's mind. The Thornery sent nothing at all, calling the whole thing a waste of life. And then the humans responded to the summons, and the Kethvari court was curious. For humans were a relatively new species to the galactic community, soft and squishy and utterly unremarkable in almost every way, possessing no natural weapons, no psychic abilities, no special adaptations that would suggest any chance of success. The human they sent was not a warrior or a tamer or a mystic, but a cultural attach named Elliot Chen, a 34-year-old man who specialized in xenocultural communications and who had volunteered for this mission because he had completely misread the assignment brief, thinking he was supposed to observe a ceremonial bonding ritual rather than participate in one. By the time Elliot realized his mistake, he was already on a ship heading toward Kethver Prime, and it was far too late to turn back. And he sat in his cabin staring at the correct briefing documents with a growing sense of horror. "Wow," he said to himself, taking a long sip of coffee. "This is certainly not what I signed up for." He had no idea that he was about to change the galaxy forever, that he would succeed where hundreds had failed, and that his success would come not from strength or power or ancient rituals, but from something far simpler and far more powerful. He had no idea that Sereth was waiting for him, and that she had been waiting for someone like him for 17 long and lonely years. Elliot Chun stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Menagerie, his coffee cup clutched in both hands like a shield, watching through the reinforced glass as medical teams carried away the latest challenger, a massive Dravosi warrior who had been so confident just minutes ago and who now hung limp and broken in their arms. The warrior's name was Korvax, and he had entered Sarath's enclosure with a ceremonial battle axe and armor that could supposedly withstand starship weapons. And he had lasted less than a minute before something dark and impossibly fast had launched him through a window that was designed to stop plasma fire. "I should leave," Elliot said to his diplomatic handler, a four-armed Kethvari named Counselor, Yith, who stood beside him with an expression that might have been pity or might have been professional detachment. "You cannot leave," Yith replied, all four of his hands folding together in a gesture that Elliot had learned meant absolute finality. "For the Emperor has already noted your species' participation in the challenge, and to withdraw now would be a declaration of cowardice. And I must tell you that wars have been declared over less." "Fantastic," Elliot muttered, taking another sip of his coffee and wondering how his life had gone so wrong so quickly. He had joined the diplomatic corps because he loved learning about alien cultures, loved finding the common ground between species that seemed completely different, loved the moment when understanding replaced fear and connection replaced isolation. And now he was going to be torn apart by a giant shadow cat because he had not read his assignment papers carefully enough. The attempt is scheduled for tomorrow morning. You've continued. And there was something almost like sympathy in his voice now. I would suggest you spend tonight preparing whatever death rituals your species practices. Elliot did not sleep that night, instead staying awake reading everything he could find about void lynxes in the Imperial database, learning about their home world and their biology and their strange abilities. And the more he read, the more fascinated he became. Void lynxes were not just predators, the records showed, but highly social creatures who lived in family groups called shadow packs. And they communicated through a combination of subsonic vocalizations and subtle body language that most other species could not perceive. And they formed bonds not just with their chosen companions, but with their entire pack, caring for their young collectively and mourning their dead with rituals that seemed almost religious. The records also showed that void lynxes had been hunted nearly to extinction by poachers who wanted their pelts and their neurotoxin glands, and that Sarath had been captured as a cub, taken from her home world when her entire pack had been slaughtered by hunters who had killed her mother and her siblings and everyone she had ever known. She had been passed between 5 different royal houses before coming to Emperor Varathan, traded like property, displayed like a trophy, and never once had anyone asked her what she wanted or treated her as anything more than a valuable possession. Oh, Elliot whispered into the darkness of his quarters. That explains so much. The next morning came too quickly, and Elliot found himself walking through the corridors of the Imperial Menagerie towards Sarath's enclosure, his legs moving automatically while his mind raced through everything he had learned. And he was still carrying his coffee because he had refused to surrender it when the guards had asked. If I'm going to die, he had told them firmly, I am not doing it uncaffeinated. The guards had looked at each other in confusion, clearly not understanding why this strange human cared more about his hot beverage than about weapons or armor, and they had eventually let him pass. Sarath's enclosure was massive, a simulated night forest from Umbrex's prime that stretched for hundreds of meters in every direction, filled with twisted black trees and floating bioluminescent spores and gravity anomalies that made navigation difficult. And somewhere in that artificial darkness, 6 silver eyes were watching. Elliot stepped through the entrance, and the heavy door sealed behind him with a sound that seemed very final. And he stood there in the dim purple light of the spores, looking around at this alien landscape and knowing that death could come from any direction at any moment. Every previous challenger had entered this place with weapons and armor and protective equipment, with shields and prayers and battle cries, but Elliot had none of those things. Just his rumpled diplomatic uniform and his rapidly cooling coffee and a growing sense of calm that surprised him. He was not calm because he was brave, and he was not calm because he had accepted death, but rather because something in this place felt familiar, felt like the animal shelters he had volunteered at during university, felt like the wounded strays his grandmother had always brought home when he was a child. The shadows moved, and Sarath emerged. She was more beautiful and more terrifying than any holographic image had suggested, a nightmare given physical form, with darkness coiling around her body like living smoke and her 6 silver eyes, burning with an intelligence that was far from animal. She moved toward him slowly, every step deliberate, every muscle tensed for violence, and Elliot knew that she was evaluating him, deciding whether to kill him quickly or slowly, or perhaps to toy with him first. But Elliot had spent his career reading body language across dozens of species, finding the universal signs of emotion that transcended biology. And what he saw in Sarath was not just aggression or predatory instinct. He saw the rigid posture of someone who had been hurt too many times and expected to be hurt again. And he saw the controlled stillness of someone who was always ready to defend themselves, because they had learned that no one else would. And he saw the way her eyes did not quite track together. An old injury that had never been properly treated because no one had cared enough to try. He saw the small alcove behind her, where she had arranged her sleeping area with almost obsessive precision, creating order in the only space she could control. And he saw the way she positioned herself between him and that alcove, protecting the only thing that was truly hers. He saw grief, and he saw loneliness, and he saw a soul that had been broken and had never been given the chance to heal. "Oh," he said softly, and his voice was gentle, the voice his grandmother had used with every wounded creature she had ever rescued. "Hey there." Sarah froze, and something flickered in her silver eyes, something that might have been surprise or confusion, or perhaps the faintest spark of hope. No one had ever spoken to her casually before. No one had ever looked at her without fear or greed or the desire to possess her. And this strange small human was doing something she had never experienced. Elliot tilted his head, studying her the way he would study any hurting creature, and the words came out before he could stop them. Words his grandmother had said 1,000 times to 1,000 different strays. "Who's the noble guy?" he murmured, his voice warm and kind and completely without fear. "Who's been so brave for so long?" Sarath's 4 ears rotated toward him, and for a long moment she simply stared. And then she did something that no one had seen her do in 17 years. She sat down, and she waited to see what this strange human would do next. The Kethvari court was in an uproar, and the news spread through the imperial palace like wildfire, carried by whispers and urgent messages and the frantic chatter of 1,000 confused voices. For something impossible had happened in the imperial menagerie. The human had survived for 10 minutes, and then an hour, and then an entire day cycle. And he was still alive, still sitting in Sarath's enclosure, still breathing and unharmed, while the most dangerous creature in the empire watched him from a distance that grew shorter with every passing hour. Counselor Yith stood before the observation windows with his 4 hands pressed against the glass, staring at the scene inside with an expression of complete disbelief. For in all his years of service, he had never seen anything like this. The human was not trying to bond with Sarath, was not performing any rituals or displaying any dominance behaviors, or using any of the techniques that the Empire's experts had developed over centuries of working with dangerous creatures. He was simply sitting on a rock, reading reports on his datapad, and occasionally talking to the Void Links in a low, steady voice about things that seemed to have no importance at all. Things like his sister's new baby, and the quality of coffee on different space stations, and a documentary about something called whales that swam in the oceans of his home world. Sarath watched him constantly, her 6 silver eyes tracking his every movement. And with each passing hour, she moved a little closer, drawn by something she did not understand, something that pulled at her wounded heart. By the 3rd day, she was lying only 6 feet away from him while he worked, close enough to kill him in an instant if she chose. But she did not choose, and instead she simply rested there, her great body relaxed in a way that the observers had never seen before. The Emperor himself came to the observation deck, his ancient face creased with wonder and confusion, and he demanded to know what technique the human was using, what secret knowledge he possessed that allowed him to accomplish what hundreds of others had failed. "I do not have a technique," Elliot admitted when they brought him out of the enclosure for questioning, and he looked tired but strangely peaceful. "And I do not have any secret knowledge. I am simply treating her like a person instead of a beast." The Kethvari court members looked at each other in confusion, for they did not understand what he meant, and one of the senior advisors stepped forward with irritation in his voice. "She is a Void Lynx," the advisor said. "Sacred, yes. Magnificent, yes, but still an animal, and animals do not respond to being treated like people." Elliot shook his head slowly, and there was something sad in his eyes, something that spoke of disappointment in beings who should have known better. "Is she really just an animal?" he asked quietly, "because she problem solves in ways I have never seen in a non-sentient creature. And she has clear preferences and dislikes that go beyond simple instinct. And she arranged her bedding in a specific pattern that changes every few days, but is always symmetrical. And she watches the spore lights for hours at a time with an expression that looks almost like remembering." He paused and looked toward the enclosure where Sareth was waiting for him to return. "I read her file," he continued, "and I know what happened to her. I know that she was captured as a cub, and that her entire pack was slaughtered by poachers, and that she has been passed between owners, like property for her entire life. And I know that no one has ever asked her what she wants or treated her grief as real." The court was silent, and Elliot's voice grew stronger. "She is not untamable," he said firmly. "She is mourning. She has been mourning for 17 years, and no one ever let her. No one ever acknowledged her loss or gave her space to heal. And instead, everyone kept trying to conquer her and possess her and force her to bond against her will." He turned to look directly at the Emperor, and there was no fear in his gaze, only a deep and quiet conviction. "I am not trying to tame her, Your Majesty. I am trying to help her, and there is a very big difference." That night, Elliot returned to the enclosure and sat in his usual spot, and Sareth moved closer than she had ever been before. Close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her massive body. "I am sorry about your family," he said softly into the darkness, and his voice was filled with genuine compassion. "I do not know if you can understand my words, but I think you understand enough to know what I mean. And I want you to know that I am truly sorry." Sareth went very still, and something shifted in the air around her. Something that felt like walls crumbling and shields lowering. "You deserve better," Elliot continued, and his eyes were wet with tears he did not try to hide. "You deserve to grow up with your pack and your mother and your siblings. You deserve to run free on your home world instead of being locked in cages and traded between strangers, and you still deserve better than this." For a long moment there was only silence. And then Sareth made a sound that Elliot had never heard before. A low subsonic rumble that vibrated through his entire body and seemed to carry more meaning than words ever could. She was crying. Elliot realized, in whatever way her species cried, she was finally allowing herself to feel the grief she had been holding inside for 17 long and terrible years. He did not try to touch her, did not try to comfort her with physical contact that might feel like another violation of her boundaries. But instead, he simply sat there with her, bearing witness to her pain, showing her that she did not have to carry it alone. They stayed like that through the night, human and void links sitting together in the darkness while the spores floated around them like stars. And something was healing in that space, something that had been broken for far too long. When Elliot woke the next morning, cramped and cold from sleeping on the ground, he found something beside him that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a perfect sphere of condensed shadow, small enough to fit in his palm, but somehow containing depths that seemed to go on forever. And it gleamed with a faint silver light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Counselor Yith explained later what it meant, his voice trembling with awe and something close to reverence. For this was a gift that only voidlinxes could create, a piece of their very essence given physical form, and it was the most precious thing they could offer. Sareth had never given such a gift to anyone in her entire life, had never trusted anyone enough to share this part of herself. But she had given it to the strange soft human who had done nothing more than see her pain and acknowledge it as real. "This means she has accepted you," Yith said, and his four hands were shaking. "Not as a master, but as something more, something we do not have a word for in our language." Elliot held the shadow sphere carefully, feeling its warmth against his skin, and he looked towards Sareth, who was watching him with something new in her silver eyes, something that looked almost like hope. "I think the word you are looking for," he said quietly, "is friend." Word of what had happened spread across the Empire and beyond, carried by news broadcasts and diplomatic channels and the endless gossip networks that connected every corner of civilized space. And soon the entire galaxy knew that a human had done the impossible. Ambassador Elliot Chun had been blessed by the Emperor's beast, they said, had formed a connection with the creature that no warrior or tamer or mystic had been able to achieve. And he had done it through methods that no one could quite understand or explain. The story was told and retold in countless variations, growing more elaborate with each passing day. And humans throughout the galaxy suddenly found themselves being looked at with new curiosity and respect. But not everyone was pleased with this development. Lord Kethmarus was the Emperor's nephew and the heir apparent to the Obsidian throne. A tall and powerful Kethvari warrior who had spent 8 years trying to bond with Sereth, enduring her attacks and her rejection again and again, because he knew that her acceptance would legitimize his claim to power. A bonded void lynx was the ultimate symbol of imperial authority, proof that the heavens themselves had chosen the one who would rule. And Kethmarus had been certain that eventually Sereth would recognize his worth and accept him as her master. Instead, she had chosen a human, a soft and weak creature from a species that the Kethvari considered barely above primitive. A species with no natural weapons and no psychic abilities and no ancient bloodlines. Kethmarus stood in his private chambers, his 4 fists clenched with rage, and he swore that he would not allow this insult to stand, that he would find a way to destroy the human and reclaim what should have been his. He searched through the ancient legal codes of the Empire, looking for anything that might help him, and finally he found what he was seeking. A law so old that most had forgotten it existed, a law called the Trial of Supremacy. The next morning, Kethmarus appeared before the imperial court in full ceremonial armor and invoked the ancient law, his voice ringing through the great hall with barely contained fury. "I challenge the human Elliot Chun," he declared, "for he has claimed the favor of the sacred beast through deception and trickery. And the law states that if another claims what should belong to a royal heir, they must prove themselves worthy through combat." The court erupted in shocked whispers, and Emperor Varathan rose from his throne with anger on his ancient face. "Nephew," the Emperor said, and his voice was cold, "you would invoke a law that has not been used in 3,000 years. A law designed for disputes between equal warriors, against a being who has never held a weapon? The law does not specify that the challenged party must be a warrior," Kethmarus replied with a cruel smile. "It states only that they must fight, and if the human truly deserves the sacred beast's favor, surely the heavens will protect him." The legal scholars were consulted, and to everyone's dismay, Kethmarus was correct, for the ancient law made no exceptions and offered no protections. And once it was invoked, it could not be refused. Elliot was brought before the court and told what was happening, and his face went pale as he realized what he was facing. For he had never been in a fight in his entire life, had never even thrown a punch. And now he was expected to face a trained warrior in a battle to the death. "You cannot be serious," he said, looking around at the assembled nobles, hoping that someone would tell him this was a joke or a misunderstanding. But no one laughed, and no one offered him hope, and Lord Kethmarus simply smiled with anticipation. Then something happened that no one expected. Sereth had been watching the proceedings through a holographic link to her enclosure, and now she did something she had never done in all her years of captivity, something that made everyone in the court freeze in shock and terror. She spoke. Her voice was a deep subsonic rumble that the translation system struggled to interpret, a sound that vibrated through the floor and walls and shook dust from the ancient rafters. And when the words finally appeared on the screens, the entire court fell silent. "He is mine," Seraph said, and there was something ancient and terrible in her voice. "Challenge him, and you challenge me." Kethmara stepped back involuntarily, his face going pale beneath his scales. For no one had known that void lynxes could speak. No one had imagined that Seraph had been choosing not to communicate all these years rather than being unable. The Emperor leaned forward on his throne, his eyes wide with wonder. For in all his decades of keeping Seraph, she had never uttered a single word. "Sacred beast," he said carefully, "do you claim this human as your bonded companion?" Sarath's response came without hesitation. "I claim him as my pack," she said. "He is my family now. He saw my grief when no one else would look. He acknowledged my pain when everyone else tried to conquer it. And he asked nothing from me except to be allowed to help." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was filled with something that sounded almost like love. "I have not bonded with him in the way your traditions demand," she said. "I have done something more. I have chosen him as an equal. As a true member of my shadow pack, and among my people, that bond is deeper and stronger than anything your species understands." The court was in chaos, nobles arguing with scholars, priests consulting ancient texts, and Kethmara stood in the middle of it all with fury burning in his eyes. "The beast does not make laws," he snarled. "The trial will proceed, and when I kill the human, I will prove that her judgment means nothing." The Emperor had no choice, for the law was the law, and even his power could not overturn it without undermining the very foundations of imperial authority. Elliot was given 3 days to prepare for the trial. He spent those days not in combat training, for there was no point in trying to learn in 3 days what Kethmaros had studied for his entire life. But instead he spent them with Seraph, learning about her people and her culture, and what it truly meant to be part of a shadow pack. She told him about Umbraxis Prime, about the endless night and the hunting songs and the way her mother had taught her to phase through shadows when she was just a cub. And she told him about the day the poachers came and killed everyone she loved. She told him about the loneliness that followed, about being sold and traded and treated like an object, about learning to hate because hate was easier than grief. And she told him about the hope she had given up on ever feeling again. And she told him about the moment he had walked into her enclosure with his coffee and his kind eyes and had asked who the noble guy was, and how something inside her had cracked open in that moment, something that had been sealed shut for 17 years. "I cannot win against Kethmaros," Elliot admitted on the last night before the trial, his voice heavy with fear and resignation. "He is stronger and faster and trained for combat, and I am just a diplomat who reads too much." Seraph pressed her great head against his shoulder, and the shadows around her pulsed with warmth and comfort. "You are not fighting alone," she said, and her voice was gentle but filled with absolute certainty. "You never were a little human, and you never will be again." She told him about pack tactics, about how void lynxes fought together as one unit, about how the bond between pack members made them stronger than any individual could ever be. "The law says you must fight," she said, "but it does not say you must fight alone. And where you go, I go, for that is what pack means." Elliot looked into her 6 silver eyes and saw something there that made his fear melt away, something that looked like faith and trust and love. And he realized that no matter what happened tomorrow, he was not going to face it by himself. "Then let us show them," he said quietly, "what pack really means." The Grand Colosseum of Kethver Prime had stood for 10,000 years, its ancient stones soaked with the blood of countless warriors who had fought and died within its walls. And today, it was filled to capacity with over 10,000 spectators who had come to witness the trial of supremacy. The crowd roared as Lord Kethmaros entered the arena, his ceremonial battle armor gleaming in the light of 3 suns. his plasma glaive crackling with energy that could cut through starship hulls. And he raised his weapon in salute to the Emperor, who sat watching from the royal box. He was magnificent and terrifying, a perfect example of HFY warrior breeding, and the crowd cheered for him because they knew that victory was certain, that the soft human would fall within seconds. Then Elliot Chen walked through the opposite entrance, and the crowd fell silent with confusion. He was wearing his diplomatic uniform, freshly pressed, but still somehow slightly rumpled. And he carried no weapons and wore no armor, and beside him walked Sereth, her shadow fur rippling with barely contained power, her 6 silver eyes burning with fierce protective love. The crowd whispered in shock, for technically bonded beasts were permitted to accompany their companions in trials. But Sereth had never participated in anything before, had never fought for anyone, and her presence changed everything. Kethmaris sneered at them from across the arena, his confidence unshaken by this development. "You hide behind a beast, human?" he called out, his voice echoing through the Colosseum. "You bring her to fight your battles because you are too weak to face me yourself." Elliot shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and clear, carried to every corner of the arena by the amplification systems. "I am not hiding behind anyone," he said. "I am standing beside her, and that is the part you never understood. My lord, that is the part none of you understood." He stepped forward, and Sereth moved with him, their movements perfectly synchronized like they had been fighting together for years instead of days. "She's not a weapon," Elliot continued, and his voice grew stronger with every word. "She is not a symbol of power. She is not property to be owned or a prize to be won. She is a person who lost everything and was never given the chance to grieve." The Colosseum was completely silent now, every being present hanging on his words. "All I did was see her," Elliot said. "I looked at her, and I saw her pain and her loneliness and her grief. And I acknowledged that those things were real. And I asked nothing from her except to be allowed to help." He turned to look directly at Kethmaros, and there was no fear in his eyes anymore, only a quiet certainty that seemed to fill the entire arena. "That is all any of us want," he said softly. "To be seen, to be understood, to know that we are not alone in this vast and terrifying universe." He paused and took a deep breath, and when he continued, his voice rang with power and conviction. "Humanity does not have psychic abilities," he declared. "We cannot phase through solid matter or bend shadows to our will. We have no natural weapons and no special adaptations. And by any galactic standard, we should have died on our home world long ago." The crowd leaned forward, captivated by this strange human who spoke with such passion. "But we survived," Elliot said. "We conquered our death world not through strength or speed or psychic power, but by doing one thing better than anyone else in the galaxy. We learned to pack bond with anything." He gestured around the Colosseum at the thousands of different species watching. "We look at creatures completely different from ourselves, creatures that should be our enemies or our prey, and we say 4 simple words that change everything. We say, 'You are family now.'" His voice rose until it echoed off the ancient stones. "We befriend wolves and turn them into companions who would die for us," he shouted. "We tame horses and ride them into battle. We keep tiny birds in our homes just because we love their songs. And we look at wounded strays that everyone else has abandoned, and we ask who is the noble guy." He turned back to Kethmaris, and now there was something dangerous in his eyes. "That is not weakness," he said firmly. "That is the strongest thing in the universe. Because there is no power greater than love, no weapon sharper than compassion, no armor stronger than the bond between those who have chosen to be family." He reached down and placed his hand on Sereth's head, and she pressed up into his touch with a rumbling purr that shook the floor. "So no," Elliot said. "She is not fighting my battle. We are fighting together, because that is what pact does. And if you want to destroy either of us, you will have to go through both of us." Kathmaros roared with fury and charged. He was fast, impossibly fast, his plasma glaive trailing fire as he closed the distance in an instant. And his first strike would have cut Elliot in half if it had connected. But it did not connect. Sareth moved like a living eclipse, phasing through Kathmaros' S-weapon as if it did not exist, her shadow-wrapped body flowing around his strike with impossible grace. And then she was inside his guard, her claws resting gently against his throat. She could have killed him in that moment, could have ended his life with a single twitch of her massive paw. And the crowd held its breath, waiting for the death blow to fall. But Sareth did not strike. Instead, she looked at Elliot, her silver eyes asking a question that needed no words. And Elliot shook his head. "Mercy," he said softly. "Always mercy, if we can." Sareth withdrew her claws and stepped back, leaving Kathmaros alive and unharmed but utterly defeated, his weapon dissolving into smoke where she had touched it with her entropic shadows. His reputation shattered before the entire empire. The guards carried Lord Kathmaros from the arena, his face twisted with humiliation and rage, and the crowd erupted into cheers that shook the ancient Colosseum to its foundations. Emperor Vorthene IX rose from his throne and descended into the arena, something he had not done in decades. And he walked slowly toward Elliot and Sareth with wonder in his ancient eyes. "You have done what no one in the galaxy could do," he said, and his voice was filled with respect. "You have given her peace, and you have given us a lesson we did not know we needed." He paused and looked at them both, the strange human and the magnificent beast who had chosen each other. "What do you want?" the Emperor asked. "Name your reward. Anything within my power to give." Elliot considered for a long moment, thinking about all the things he could ask for, the political power and wealth and influence that could be his. But then he looked at Sareth, and he knew exactly what he needed to say. "I want her to choose," he said simply. "Whatever she wants to do, wherever she wants to go, it should be her decision. It always should have been." Sareth pressed her great head against his shoulder, and the shadows around her pulsed with love and gratitude and something that felt like coming home. "I choose to stay," she said, and her voice was soft but certain. "I choose my pack. I choose my family. I choose him." The Emperor bowed, a gesture of respect he had not offered to anyone in 50 years. And he bowed not just to Elliot but to both of them. And across the galactic networks, the story spread like wildfire. The tale of the human who had tamed the untamable, not through strength or power, but through the simple revolutionary act of kindness. 6 months later, Ambassador Elliot Chun sat in his quarters on Kethver Prime, reviewing trade negotiations on his datapad, while Sareth lay beside him with her shadow fur warm against his leg and her 6 eyes half closed in contentment. She had gained weight since those first terrible days, and she slept peacefully now without the nightmares that had haunted her for 17 years. And sometimes she even played, batting at the bioluminescent spores like a kitten before pretending she had done no such thing. "You know," Elliot said, scratching behind her lower ears, "my grandmother would have loved you." Sarath's rumbling purr shook the furniture. "Tell me about her," she said. So he did. He told her about Earth and humanity and all the strays and broken things his family had loved back to wholeness across generations. And Sareth listened with her great head in his lap and her heart full of the peace she had finally found. And somewhere in the void between stars, the galaxy took note and trembled. The humans were strange. They whispered. The humans were soft. The humans would pact bond with anything that moved and many things that did not. And that, perhaps, made them the most dangerous and the most wonderful species of all. For they had taught the galaxy something it had forgotten, something precious and powerful and true. That kindness was not weakness. That compassion was not surrender. And that the question, Who is the noble guy could tame even the wildest heart?